That was my best entrance so far.
I know,
Thank
what
you
a crowd.
for that. Love the energy. Thanks everybody for being here. Excited to continue the conversation with two philanthropies that are doing a lot of great work on energy, which is my area, and energy access. Maybe just to start with a bit of the context, Jonathan. So Shell Foundation, you're working on improving energy access in emerging markets, Africa, India, and other places. We're in the middle of a global energy crisis right now. Many of the countries where you work are sort of the most exposed to rising oil and gas prices because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Can you say a little bit about what you're taking away from this crisis in terms of the value of producing energy locally, of having non-fossil energy? How does this affect the people that you're working with?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So the foundation fundamentally is focused on enabling people to raise their income through the use of energy, right? And these are mostly people who are experiencing low income, mostly in India and Africa. It's absurd that a farmer in rural Kenya has to be thinking about what's happening in the Gulf. It's also unnecessary, right? There are instruments and equipment that can enable that farmer to triple her income using energy that is immediately available, like within arm's reach, right? So, for example, a solar-powered water pump can triple the income of a farmer. I've been on a farm that went from 500 chickens to 1,500 chickens with power that they were producing on site on the farm. There's a lot of solutions like that. And so you need to think about these things, not so much about the energy transition, but energy security. And energy security, which we think about mostly in a national level, energy security at the human level, right? In that last yard is where the difference is really made.
Can you just follow up on that? So what is the private sector or governments missing in providing that kind of access that requires philanthropy to come in? What is the sort of missing piece that you're trying to fill there?
Right. So from the public sector side, I think it tends to be the case that governments, and especially multi-governmental organizations, think about big power, right? Huge plants, huge facilities. The bigger, the better. That would seem to be correct for economies of scale, but it is fundamentally incorrect in most places where, for example, the transmission lines are just never going to build out that way, right? The more viable power, the cheaper power, and as we're learning now, the more secure power is that which is right at hand. Right?
And why approach this with? But what about the private sector? I mean, there's a lot of like micro solar solution companies that are working in that space.
Right. So we work exclusively on products and projects that have commercial viability. Right. So what's the role of a philanthropy if it's commercially viable? It's to de-risk the early stage, right? To take the first risk. So, for example, the solar water pump I just told you about. No one knows what the non-performing loan rate is when you borrow money to buy that pump. You have to prove that out in the marketplace before banks can make that loan. We take that risk, right? We're willing to take a well-defined, time-limited exposure to demonstrate that the commercial viability of that product for a bank. Now, of the 15 products that we might look at in a year, 5, maybe 7 won't prove commercial, but the other 7 will, and then we can withdraw.
John, can you expand? So you're focused on the U.S. Households in the U.S., but I want to ask a similar question about inflation and exposure to higher energy prices. A big issue for a lot of families in America right now. Not just because of the war in Iran, but also this whole data center issue, and there's a lot of things that are driving prices up. Can you say a little bit about how you're viewing energy price inflation, how that's affecting the families that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, just to back up for a second, in America, it wasn't a surprise to us at GreenLight when the budget shut down. We have 40 to 50 million Americans that are on SNAP benefits, right? So we have this scale problem with poverty in the U.S. Maybe 40, 50 million children and families living in poverty, and economic and social mobility is nowhere near the way we want it to be. If you look at the statistics, it might be maybe 5 to 7% that will go up, a decile or whatever. So the American dream is possible, but we don't have anywhere near the economic and social mobility that we want. And we set up GreenLight so that we could operate in 15, soon to be 17 cities across the country. I can say publicly today for the first time that Nashville and DC will be our 16th and 17th cities.
News.
So what we set up, and eventually to get to hopefully 30 to 50 cities in the United States to change outcomes at scale. We're reaching a couple million children and families a year now. Hopefully that'll be like 20 million children and families a year in about 10 years as GreenLight scales. Now, all these issues are sort of exacerbated, obviously, by inflation, energy costs, economic dislocation. And so I would say, they threaten to make economic and social mobility, worse rather than better. And so I think it's incumbent on both the private sector and government working together to try to really lots of different things, including what's being done now, and do more of it, but also new innovation, new things like what we represent at GreenLight, to try to really shift the curve and shift the outcomes. Because it's rough right now if you're living in poverty in the US, and it could get a little rougher, but not if we all pitch in.
Right. You have a background in venture capital. Can you say a bit about what you borrow from that experience into GreenLight, and what are the kind of pros that you take away? I guess one con that I was thinking, I mean, it feels like the part of the philosophy of venture capital is you take a lot of bets, many of them fail, you have a few that succeed spectacularly. So how does that map onto philanthropic?
Yeah, people sometimes will talk about, because I'm a venture capitalist, having co-founded General Catalyst Partners, a large firm, now has about $50 billion under management. People sometimes think, well, okay, if I'm doing something in the nonprofit world, it must be venture philanthropy. But it's not really, because in venture capital, a typical portfolio, maybe you make 30 investments, and maybe 10 of them don't work at all. Maybe 10 of them work modestly, and then 10 are the home runs, the DocuSigns and so on and so forth. But what we're trying to do at GreenLight is every year in every city look at a metric that's broken around low-income children and families, and then can we bring something that worked in 5 other cities and was proven at scale? Can we bring that to our city to make change, give it $1 million, greenlight it, but only if the public school system's gonna agree it's gonna roll it out, or the city is gonna roll it out as a partner, or the housing authority will, make sure that we enroll everybody or whatever. So deep partnerships to make sure that it's locally driven and locally happens. So the lesson we learned from venture capital is, a lot of things can be tried but won't work. With GreenLight, what we're trying to do is pick those things that have worked and help those things scale, right? Because people expect, if we come to DC, that in 20 years, we'll bring 16 outcome-changing things to DC that will work, and that all of them will work, right? Or that, in 10, 11 years, we'll bring 8 things to the Bay Area, that all of them have worked. So I think that's really important, because there's so much need, and there's so many things that have been proven, but they have a hard time spreading. So I think there is a room for venture philanthropy, and without getting into detail about the previous speaker, Ryan, there's room to innovate and pilot and stuff. It's just that's not what we do at GreenLight.
Yeah.
Because we think, okay, there's another segment of the market that does that. An also huge problem, in addition to developing new things that may or may not work, is how do we take the things that work and how we scale them to where they're dramatically needed? Because isn't it a shame that in Charlotte, there might be 20 metrics that are really bad around low-income children and families. We know things that work that could change those metrics, but they're never going to get to Charlotte. So GreenLight does that, right? We bring one great thing every year.
Jonathan, can you expand again sort of on this, your business model? And you were talking about sort of being the first capital and doing this kind of de-risking function. How do you ensure that philanthropic money that's going into these small businesses, the places where you're deploying, is genuinely catalytic and doesn't cover for businesses that can't stand on their own, or you want to make sure you're not subsidizing failure in some way. Yeah.
So that's a huge challenge, at least in our space, is the risk of disrupting, distorting the market.
Right.
And especially not only drawing capital towards things that won't work, more importantly, drawing talent to things that won't work. We see that again and again in emerging markets, right, with donor money. So
how do you prevent that?
Right. So there's our own internal discipline. So it begins again with talent. It's our own people who are overwhelmingly out of commercial and financial backgrounds and have come into this space with that mindset, and we encourage them never to lose it, right? Then it's also the partners we're working with. We never go into a partnership that doesn't have a commercial basis at its end and hasn't already been defined what the commercial parameters will be by the end. So if we're going into, let's say, to launch a pilot for some new technology that we're scaling with a partner of ours, ITC, one of the largest agribusinesses in all of India, right? We define with them what's the internal hurdle rate that you need to see in order to sustain this without us, and we're benchmarking against that from the first day of the program, right? And if it's falling short, we'll stop that program.
Yeah. John, I'm also curious about, could you just expand on, we talked about energy inflation. I'm also interested in affordable housing. What are you seeing? What are most cities getting wrong about affordable housing?
Okay, you've hit on a topic that's kind of a favorite now, because I didn't know a ton about it when I started or co-founded GreenLight, and then as GreenLight has grown to cities. But the more I travel to cities, affordable housing is an absolutely massive issue in cities across the US. I would say a lot of the cities where GreenLight is operating, maybe 40, 50,000 units short of affordable housing.
Wow.
So if you just aggregate that, I mean, it's over 1 million units just across GreenLight cities. So this is really, right now, a huge gaping need in the US, especially in major urban cities. And it's not getting any better because affordable housing is not being built at any kind of a rate. So you need to think about that. Because it has all kinds of limitations for families, for urban areas, for gentrification, et cetera. And so what we're doing at GreenLight is, because this is such a huge need in cities, we're trying to identify solutions we could bring to cities that could actually move the needle without spending billions of dollars on affordable housing. And we've done multiple things with housing authorities to change outcomes and actually increase effective availability. I'll just talk quickly about two. One is we brought this thing called Compass Working Capital to Philadelphia, and we've now brought it to Chicago, and it actually increases assets in savings accounts for families that are living in affordable housing. Philadelphia, over a 10, 15-year period, because we brought Compass Working Capital to Philadelphia, there's about $70 million more in people's bank accounts who are living in affordable housing than otherwise had been there. That's enabled people to move out of affordable housing, which has effectively increased the stock of affordable housing by, let's say, 1,000 units. Wow. So what would it cost to build that? I don't know, $700 million or whatever. So that's one thing, and we certainly see need for that in lots of GreenLight cities. Also recently, we've announced bringing Housing Connector, which is a nonprofit, to 2 different cities, which essentially creates a website for all availability of affordable housing in a city so that it's a one-stop shop, and then actually changes incentives for landlords with insurance and a variety of things that encourages landlords who aren't necessarily offering for affordable housing to offer for affordable housing, because it tips the economic incentives. Maybe you could actually even make more money while you're doing good.
Yeah.
And our estimate is that'll add over 1,000 units of affordable housing effectively to Miami, where we brought it, and similarly to Newark. And again, similar needs in other cities. So those aren't, massive solutions to look at, what about a 1 million unit shortage?
Right.
But for thousands of families in every city, that's gonna make a difference. So my answer is huge problem. I think we need public finance to be rethought. We need a lot of things to be rethought. We need attention to be paid for it.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, there are things we could do, and it's crazy if we don't do those things that we can do in cities that we can do them in, and that's what we're doing at GreenLight.
That's great. Jonathan, can you say a bit about how you see the relationship between philanthropy and private capital changing? I mean, obviously, Shell Foundation, originally seeded by a private corporation, Shell, and so I mean, how do you kind of see that relationship evolving?
Right. So that model is probably the model that people are most familiar with, right? Private capital makes a lot of money, and then it deploys it into philanthropy. The nature of that relationship is changing. So in the current, with the current withdrawal of public funding from a lot of work, particularly work in our parts of the world, every philanthropy I know of is now talking about how are we going to catalyze private capital, right? That's the sustainable source of capital. Now, I'm fortunate to be in an organization that's been doing that for 25 years, right? That's all we've done is come from the beginning, commercial solutions to social problems. So if you're going to catalyze private capital, and we do about 13x of our own program budget, winds up getting, it gets multiplied about 13x, about 84% of that last year was private capital. If you want to get to those numbers, you have to accept certain things that are not common for a philanthropy. Like, for example, you need to be willing to take, as I said, the earliest risk, right, on something that someone else is going to put in private money later. And you have to get very comfortable with the idea that some private money is going to make a lot of money on your philanthropic spend. Now, that's not a comfortable space for most philanthropy to sit in. But if you're catalyzing private capital, that's exactly the space you need to inhabit.
That you have to be in, right? What about the gap? How have you experienced the gap that's been left behind by the pullback of federal aid funding from the U.S., the dismantling of USAID? How has that affected your work?
Yeah, so you know, the overall, it's had surely an aversive effect on the overall environment, right? So not just USAID, but many of the European agencies have also fallen back, in part because they need to take care of defense at home, right? That landscape has changed. But also there's been a retrenchment, I think, I think it's a passing retrenchment, but of commercial capital around climate and climate finance in the global south. So there's been that money washing out. Within that context, we actually benefit because of the model that I just described, right? We've, for a long time, been catalyzing private capital. So that's not new territory for us. We might be reaching out to different private capital now. We're looking, we engage with partners in Southeast Asia and South Asia and the Gulf much more than we used to. But it's the same basic formula that we've been pursuing for 25 years.
Yeah. John, can you say a little bit about how you guys are using AI these days?
Yeah, so GreenLight, obviously, like every other organization, trying to use AI to improve our internal processes. But what's interesting is, and remember the way our model works, every year we look in a city at a metric that's broken, whether it's kindergarten reading level or unemployment or homelessness or whatever, and can we find something that worked in other cities and bring it to our city to make change and make enduring change, and then measure and make sure we're making that change at scale and then expand something statewide if we could. So that's what happens every year in every city. And if I go back about 10 years ago when we were operating maybe in 6 cities or something, almost nothing that we were bringing to a city used any kind of technology at all, let alone AI. If I think about the last, let's say, 18 months and maybe 15 things we brought to cities, a good 80% of those, the code is a key part of how it makes the impact and difference that it makes. And so I think that's going to continue in the future, which is using AI and using machine learning and new technologies. Social entrepreneurs or nonprofit leaders are thinking, how can I use this technology to deliver an impact at scale? Because if I could, it would be more scalable, it would be more measurable, it could extend not just to urban poverty, but to rural poverty, so it'd have more spreadability. And I just think we're going to see, hopefully, an explosion of AI for good, but it's not trusted, right? And so GreenLight has to work. If we're going to bring something to a city, how can we bring it with the right partnerships? How can we localize it so that it's trusted, adopted? And then you really get change. So you need this new technology, but then you need this local pull, trust, and delivery. And I think without both of those things, it won't have the promise that it does, but hopefully it can.
Yeah. Guys, 30 seconds. This is the panel about the future of philanthropy. How is philanthropy going to be most different in 20 years? Are we going to still need philanthropy in 20 years? What do you think, Jonathan?
You know, a famous man once said, "There will be poor always." I suspect we will still need philanthropy. To the point that John was just making, I think the current technology will be a huge change. Now, like him, we're looking at our operations improving. But what it really does, AI, unlocks visibility of the poor. I mean, one of the hardest things for the poor, all dispossessed, is that they are unseen. I.e., AI offers the opportunity to see them more effectively and at scale.
John, what's the biggest thing that'll be different in 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll see a lot of the same. So, a lot of the things that are happening now, you're going to see them continue to happen. So it's not like a shift, right? But I think it's an and, which is you're going to see the emergence of scale solutions. And hopefully, we're going to grow the pie from 1% to 2% of GDP, to double that.
We hope so.
Yeah.
John and Jonathan, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.